Why the Galactic Council banned Earth. The truth is terrifying. A recorded account by Veth Kalu, Senior Observer, Shriven Collective Intelligence Division. The first thing you need to understand is that I am not writing this because I regret what I did. I voted to ban Earth. I signed the order. I pressed the seal of the Shriven Collective onto that document with my own hands, and I watched the courier carry it into the council chamber. I would do it again tomorrow if they asked me. But the reason I voted the way I did, the real reason, is nothing like what they told you. The official record is a comfortable lie. This is the truth, and the truth is something far more unsettling than a simple story about a dangerous species from a distant star. My name is Veth Kalu. I served 31 years as a xenobiological observer for the Shriven Collective Intelligence Division, which is a long title that means I was the person they sent to look at things no one else wanted to look at. I have cataloged species that breathe methane. I have floated above oceans of liquid nitrogen and watched creatures the size of mountain ranges drift beneath me like sleeping giants. I have seen things that made my colleagues lose sleep for a decade. None of those things scared me the way Earth scared me. And none of those things were banned. We found Sol 3 the same way we find most inhabited worlds, by accident. One of our long-range relay probes, during a routine recalibration sweep in the outer arm of the galaxy, picked up an electromagnetic signature that did not match any known natural source. The pattern was too irregular to be a pulsar, too repetitive to be random interference. It took the analysis team 11 days to conclude what they were looking at, and when they sent me the report, I remember sitting at my desk for a very long time before I could respond. Structured radio signals, thousands of them, millions actually, all layered on top of each other in a chaotic, overlapping mess of frequencies, as if an entire civilization had decided to scream into space simultaneously and without any coordination. The Shriven Council immediately classified it as a priority contact event and authorized a full observation mission. I was chosen to lead it, which at the time felt like an honor. I know better now. We approached Sol 3 on a suppressed signature trajectory, standard protocol for per-contact observation. The planet came into visual range during what the locals call morning on their northern landmasses, and my first impression was that our instruments were malfunctioning. The readouts made no sense. The atmospheric composition was almost 40% oxygen, which is extraordinarily reactive, essentially the planetary equivalent of keeping your home filled with highly flammable gas. The surface temperature variance between the poles and the equator was severe enough that it should have prevented stable, complex ecosystems from forming. There were weather events powerful enough to level structures, geological events that reshaped coastlines, and a radiation environment that, by Shriven biological standards, would be considered quietly lethal over long periods of time. My chief science officer, Orentha, pulled up the readouts and looked at them for a long moment. Then she looked at me. Then she looked at the readouts again. "Nothing lives here," she said. She was wrong, of course. Something did live there, billions of somethings. We spent the first 3 days simply counting heat signatures, and we kept losing track because the numbers were too large for our initial sampling models. The creatures, the humans, as we would later learn to call them, had colonized nearly every landmass on the planet, including regions so cold that their own bodily fluids should have frozen, and regions so hot and dry that water, which they required to survive, was almost entirely absent. They had built structures in deserts. They had built structures in frozen mountain ranges. They had built structures on platforms floating in the middle of open ocean. They were, by any reasonable biological measure, absolutely everywhere, and they showed no signs of stopping. My field assistant, a young researcher named Pellin who had never been on a first contact mission before, was the one who first flagged the behavioral anomaly that would go on to define our entire mission report. He called me over to his observation screen on the 4th day, and he pointed at a small creature, a human child, we later determined, based on size and proportional development, who was attempting to climb a tree near the edge of what appeared to be a residential area. The child climbed approximately 4 meters, lost its grip and fell. Pelin and I both watched the impact. The child lay still for a moment. Then it made a noise, a vocalization we later identified as crying, an audible distress signal common to young humans. The crying lasted, by my count, roughly 85 seconds. Then the child stood up, looked at the tree, and began climbing it again. Pelin turned to me with an expression I had not seen on a shriven face in many years. It was the expression of someone who has just encountered something they genuinely cannot process. "It fell," he said. "Yes," I said. "And now it is climbing again." "Yes." "The same tree." "Yes, Pelin." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, very carefully, as if testing the words to see if they made sense, "It learned nothing from what just happened to it." I noted in my observation log that evening that this was not, in fact, accurate. The child had learned something. The child had learned that the tree could be climbed 4 meters before the grip failed. The child then adjusted its approach, slower this time, more deliberate, testing each branch before committing weight to it. By the second attempt, it reached 5 meters before it had to stop. It did not fall the second time. What the child had done was not fail to learn from pain. It had used pain as information and immediately applied that information to the next attempt. This is a distinction that sounds small. It is not small. Every other species in my catalog of contact events treats pain as a signal to withdraw, to avoid, to find a different path. Humans treat pain as data. They collect it, analyze it, and use it to go further than they went before. I wrote in my log that night, "They do not retreat from damage, they harvest it." I did not sleep well after writing that. The discovery that unsettled the entire crew came on day 6 of our observation window. Orentha had been compiling an ecological survey of the planet's megafauna, the large animals that shared the world with the humans, and she came to me with results that required a second opinion because she was not sure she trusted her own analysis. I sat with her for an hour going through the data. When we were done, I understood why she had looked uncertain. The conclusion was straightforward and deeply strange. Humans had no natural predators. Not because predators had never existed. The fossil record was full of them. Large and powerful animals that should have kept the human population in natural balance the way predators do on every other inhabited world we have ever studied. But those animals were gone. All of them. Not extinct from environmental change or disease. Gone because the humans had, over a long span of time, outcompeted them, displaced them, and in many cases actively removed them from the landscape. The apex predators of Earth were the humans themselves. They sat at the top of every food chain on the planet, not because they were the largest or the fastest or the most physically powerful. They were none of those things, but because they were relentless, adaptable, and organized in ways that no other species on the planet could match or anticipate. Orentha put the summary on the screen, and we both read it in silence. "Every large animal that ever hunted them," she said, "is either gone or reduced to living in the spaces humans allow them to occupy." I looked at the planet below us. The cities, the roads, the sprawling, complicated, endlessly expanding footprint of a species that had, in a remarkably short geological span, simply decided that the world belonged to them and then acted accordingly. "They did not inherit the top of the food chain," I said, mostly to myself. "No," Orentha agreed. "They climbed to it." She nodded slowly. I filed my preliminary report to the Shriven Council that evening. It was 40 pages long, and the last line read, "Recommend extended observation. This species does not behave according to any existing model. Request authorization for long-term cultural analysis before any contact decision is made." The council approved the request immediately, which should have relieved me. Instead, it made me more anxious. In 31 years. They had never approved an extended observation request within the same day. Even the council, reading those 40 pages from a safe distance, had already begun to understand that Sol 3 was different. They just did not know yet how different. Neither did I. But I was about to find out. We had been in orbit for 3 weeks when Pelin cracked the primary human data compression format and gave us access to what I can only describe as the full recorded memory of a civilization. Humans, it turned out, stored vast quantities of information in networked digital systems that broadcast constantly and without encryption, as if the concept of information security had simply not occurred to them, or, more accurately, as if they had thought about it, decided it was too inconvenient, and largely ignored it. Once Pelin had the compression key, we could access almost anything. We started with history. This was a mistake, not because the history was dangerous, though it was, but because none of us were prepared for the emotional experience of watching a species accumulate 10,000 years of recorded catastrophe and survive all of it. Orentha had to take 2 days away from the screens after the first week of analysis. Pelin began keeping detailed notes in a personal journal, which he later told me was the only way he could process what he was reading. I developed what I can only describe as a persistent low-level dread that followed me from my waking hours into sleep. What we found in the human historical record was this: they had been in conflict with each other, continuously and extensively, for as far back as their records went. Not over resources, at least not primarily. Not over territory, though territory was often involved. The deepest and most sustained conflicts in their history were fought over ideas. Abstract concepts that had no physical form, beliefs about the nature of reality, about the correct way to organize a society, about which symbols deserved reverence and which deserved contempt. They had fought enormous, world-spanning conflicts over these things. They had lost generations of their population to wars that were, at their core, arguments about how to interpret documents. Orentha, when she came back from her 2 days away, sat down across from me and asked the question that had been sitting in the room since we started reading. Why did they keep doing it? I did not have a good answer. By every rational model we had, a species that sustained that level of internal conflict should have exhausted itself, should have reached a point where the cost of fighting became so obvious that the fighting stopped. And yet humans kept going, not because they were unable to reason, because their history also showed extraordinary periods of cooperation, innovation, and construction. They were perfectly capable of working together. They simply chose, with a regularity that defied comfortable explanation, to also choose conflict. The answer, we eventually concluded, was that conflict was not a failure state for humans. It was a mode of operation. They fought, they rebuilt, they reorganized, and then they came back to the problems they had been fighting about with new information and often new solutions. The conflict itself was part of the process. It was chaotic and expensive and painful, and it produced results that pure cooperation might never have generated. Pelin was the one who found the document that broke my composure for the first time. He found it buried in a digital archive from approximately 80 years before our observation window, from a period when humans had developed weapons capable of ending their civilization entirely. A development that any rational species would treat as an automatic reason to stop fighting immediately. Instead, humans had pointed these weapons at each other for decades in a state of standoff, so tense that multiple near incidents had come within minutes of triggering a chain of events from which recovery would have been essentially impossible. And then they had not used the weapons. They had stood at the edge for decades, looked down and stepped back. Not because they had become peaceful, not because the conflicts that led to the standoff had been resolved, because they had, through a combination of negotiation, exhaustion, and the slow, grinding work of people on all sides who simply refused to let the worst outcome happen, managed to hold the whole thing together long enough for the situation to change. They looked at complete annihilation, Pelin said, and chose not to. Yes, I said. How? I thought about it for a long time. I think, I said, because they decided the future was worth more than whatever the present conflict felt like it required. This was not a satisfying answer. It was not meant to be. It was the closest I could get to describing something that I still cannot fully rationalize even now. Humans, when pressed to their absolute limit, have a tendency to refuse the limit. Not always, not every time, but often enough that it has shaped their entire history. I filed a note with the council. Request that the psychological modeling team review all existing first contact behavioral frameworks. Current models do not account for a species that treats potential extinction as a negotiating position rather than a terminal outcome. The modeling team wrote back within a day. They said the request was unprecedented. I told them that was exactly the point. But the history was not what kept me up at night. The history, however strange, was at least comprehensible as a sequence of events with causes and consequences. What kept me awake was something far simpler. It was a pattern I noticed in week 2 of the cultural analysis, and once I noticed it, I could not stop seeing it everywhere. Humans build things they will never see finished. Not occasionally, not as a quirk, routinely, intentionally, and with full knowledge that the timescale of the project exceeds their own lifespan. Their cities contain infrastructure planned across generations. Their scientific institutions run programs that expect results in 100 years. Their religious buildings, some of which took centuries to complete, were begun by people who understood that no one alive at the start would be alive at the end. They plant trees whose shade they will never sit under. They write laws intended to govern people not yet born. They design systems meant to outlast everyone who designed them. Every other species we had ever encountered built within the scope of what they expected to personally experience. This is rational. This is, from a biological standpoint, how living things are supposed to work. You act within your own time frame. You plan for your own future. The idea of investing deeply in a future you will never inhabit is, by every standard model of evolutionary behavior, irrational. Humans do it constantly, eagerly, proudly. I watched recordings of human leaders standing in front of newly begun structures and talking about what those structures would mean for their grandchildren, and the audiences listening to them were moved. They applauded. The idea of building something for people who did not exist yet was not a strange, uncomfortable obligation for humans. It was a source of meaning, a reason to care, a thing that made the present effort feel worthwhile. I filed a Category 7 psychological anomaly report, the highest category in our classification system, and noted, species demonstrates consistent motivation derived from non-personal future outcomes. This behavior is unprecedented in the contact record. Its implications for long-term species trajectory are unknown but likely significant. What I meant, but did not write in official language because I was not sure the council was ready to read it, was this: a species that cares about a future it will never see has no natural ceiling on what it will work toward. Every other species we had ever met was bounded, at some deep level, by the limits of personal and generational self-interest. Humans were bounded by something else entirely, something I did not have a clean word for in Shriven. The closest translation I could find was, everything they will ever become. I did not know at that point how right I was. What I did know, sitting in my observation chair above a blue and green world that had no business being as complicated as it was that the contact recommendation I had been sent here to write was going to be the most difficult document of my career. Because the honest answer to the question of whether humanity should be contacted was not yes or no. It was something harder. The honest answer was, whatever you decide, make sure you have thought it through very carefully, because these people do not react to surprises the way other species do, and you will not get a second chance to make a first impression. I was still composing that answer in my head when Pelin knocked on my cabin door, and told me that the council had already made the contact decision without waiting for my full report. They were going to introduce themselves to humanity. I closed my eyes. I pressed my fingertips together. I thought about the child climbing the tree. Then I got up and went to the bridge, because there was nothing else to do. The council ship that led the formal contact delegation was called the Voice of Consensus, which was an accurate name for a shriven vessel and a deeply ironic name for what was about to happen. It was 40 meters longer than our observation craft, beautifully built and crewed by the most carefully selected diplomatic personnel the collective had ever assembled. 38 ships accompanied it. The formation was chosen to be impressive without being aggressive, a distinction the Council's protocol team had spent considerable effort calibrating. I watched the approach from our secondary observation deck and thought, not for the last time, that we were about to learn whether all that calibration had been worth anything. First contact protocol required that we broadcast a mathematical greeting sequence on all detectable frequencies, then wait for acknowledgement before initiating visual communication. The mathematical sequence was designed to establish a common ground of shared logic, a way of saying, without words, that we were rational, organized, and interested in exchange rather than confrontation. It had worked flawlessly with every other species we had ever contacted. The humans acknowledged it in 11 minutes. This was fast, very fast. The previous record for first acknowledgement had been 4 days. What they sent back was not a counter-sequence or a confirmation signal. It was a question. One question, translated from a radio broadcast that had apparently been picked up by a human deep space monitoring station and immediately escalated to their senior leadership, which had then spent 11 minutes deciding what to ask. The question was, "Can we come?" Orentha, standing next to me, made a sound that I had never heard from a shriven before. It was somewhere between a laugh and a noise of deep concern, and I understood it completely, because I was feeling both of those things simultaneously. "They have not even confirmed what we are," Pellin said from the communication station. "They have not asked if we are peaceful. They have not asked what we want. Their first question is whether they can travel to where we are." "Yes," I said. "That is," he searched for the right word. "It is very human," I said. The Council's diplomatic team, to their credit, recovered quickly. They sent back a formal greeting, introduced themselves as representatives of the Galactic Council, explained in broad terms the nature of the Council's purpose and membership, and invited humanity to send a representative to the contact point for an initial exchange. It was a gracious, measured, perfectly constructed opening statement. The human representative responded within 6 minutes. She introduced herself as Ambassador Clara Hinton, appointed that morning by what I gathered was a hasty emergency session of multiple human governing bodies. She was direct, warm, and almost immediately practical. She expressed, on behalf of humanity, what she called extraordinary excitement at the confirmation of galactic civilization, conveyed a list of questions that she noted was only a starting point, and then asked politely, but clearly, what the Council's current trade infrastructure looked like, whether membership was open or invitation only, and what the process was for a new species to review the existing treaties that governed Council space. She had been in contact with us for less than 10 minutes. She was asking about trade infrastructure. I noted this in my report and flagged it with the observation. Humans appear to process paradigm-shifting information, including confirmation that they are not alone in the universe, without significant delay before moving to practical consideration of implications. This may indicate unusually high cognitive flexibility or an unusually low threshold for accepting new frameworks as real. What I was really thinking was, they found out they are not alone in the universe and immediately started thinking about what to do next, not how to feel about it, what to do about it. But the moment that I think about most, even now, was not the ambassador. It was what was happening behind the ambassador, in the background of the visual feed that her communications team had set up in what appeared to be a large government building. Through a window in the background of the feed, visible only if you were watching carefully, there was a screen mounted on a wall of an adjoining room. On that screen was the live broadcast of our contact fleet, which humans had already begun transmitting to their entire planet. And in front of that screen, barely visible, was a child, not more than 8 or 9 years old by human developmental standards, standing completely still, looking at the image of our ships. The child's expression was not fear. It was not confusion. It was not the wide-eyed shock that you might expect from a young creature confronting something that should, by any reasonable measure, be overwhelming. The child was leaning forward, just slightly, weight on the front of the feet, body inclined toward the screen. The expression was one I had learned to recognize by that point in my observation career. It was hunger, pure and simple and absolute, the hunger of someone who has just seen the direction they intend to travel for the rest of their life. I looked at that child for a long moment. Then I looked away, because something about it was almost too much to sit with directly. The Council invited humanity to send a formal delegation to the Council station for initial diplomatic talks. The human governing bodies, apparently, convened and made this decision in less than 2 days, which was a record by a significant margin. The previous fastest ratification of a first contact invitation had taken 6 weeks. They sent 4 people: a diplomat named Clara Hinton, who had already established herself as a clear thinker; a biologist named George Aldworth, who immediately upon arrival began asking every member of every species he encountered for detailed anatomical information, with the cheerful persistence of someone who genuinely cannot understand why this might be considered forward; an engineer named Penny Alcott, who spent the first day walking through every part of the station. She was permitted to enter and quietly nodding everything she saw with an expression of deep professional interest; and a chef. The chef's name was Owen Bray. He was a round-faced, energetic man with a complete inability to walk past a kitchen without wanting to know what was inside it. He had been included in the delegation, as best I could determine from my later conversations with Clara Hinton, because someone in the human government had decided that shared meals were diplomatically important and that therefore a professional should handle the meals. This was, I had to admit, not an irrational conclusion. It also produced the single most unexpected development of the entire contact process. Within 72 hours of Owen Bray's arrival at the Council station, 17 distinct alien species had voluntarily requested second, third, and in 2 cases fourth servings of something he had prepared called a spicy noodle dish. The primary active ingredient was a compound called capsaicin, which is a chemical that causes a mild pain response in the relevant biological receptors of several species that share overlapping sensory biology with humans. The dish, in other words, caused a small amount of discomfort and was experienced as intensely desirable because of it. I watched a senior Toreth diplomat, a species that had been part of the Council for 300 years and prided itself on reserved, formal protocol, ask Owen Bray for the recipe with an expression that I can only describe as slightly embarrassed eagerness. I wrote in my report, "Humans consume, voluntarily and for pleasure, substances that cause pain responses. They have exported this behavior to the station within 3 days of arrival. Recommend monitoring for broader cultural influence effects." What I did not write, because I was still processing it myself, was the observation that had been sitting in my mind since I watched that diplomat ask for the recipe. Humans had taken something painful and made it enjoyable, not by eliminating the pain, by framing it, by surrounding it with context and flavor and the warmth of a shared experience, until the pain itself became part of what made the thing worth wanting. They do this. I was beginning to understand with everything. I went back to my cabin that night and sat for a long time without writing anything. The contact phase was going well. Everyone was saying so. The Council's communications team was pleased. The diplomatic corps was reporting positive momentum. The human delegation was engaged, curious, and cooperative. By every standard metric, this was a successful first contact. I could not shake the feeling that we had already made a serious mistake, and that we would not understand what kind of mistake it was for a very long time. I was right about that. I was just wrong about the timeline. It did not take a long time. It took about 4 months. I want to be precise about this, because the Council's official record gets it wrong. The official record says that the decision to ban Earth was made in response to a specific incident involving a human engineering team and an unauthorized modification to a Council relay station near the boundary of restricted space. That incident did happen. It was not the reason for the ban. It was the excuse. The real reason was what I said in that chamber, and I am going to tell you exactly what I said, because someone needs to have it on record somewhere that is not controlled by the people who preferred a simpler story. I stood in front of 47 senior council members, representing 12 civilizations, and I told them the truth about what I had seen. I told them about the child and the tree. I told them about the weapon standoff that almost ended humanity and did not. I told them about the 1,000-year buildings and the plans for grandchildren not yet born. I told them about Owen Bray and the noodle dish and the Toreth diplomat asking for a recipe with embarrassed eagerness. And then I told them the thing that none of them wanted to hear. Every civilization in this chamber, I said, adapted to the obstacles it encountered. The Shriven Collective, when faced with resource scarcity 300 years ago, developed rationing systems and reduced consumption. The Toreth, when faced with a hostile neighboring species, negotiated a boundary agreement and withdrew behind it. The Meen-Haleth, when their home system became uninhabitable, relocated to the nearest suitable world and rebuilt there. These were rational responses. They were appropriate. They were exactly what a reasonable, stable civilization does when it encounters a problem it cannot easily solve. I paused because I wanted the next part to land correctly. Humans do not do this. When humans encounter an obstacle, they do not adapt around it. They go through it. They push against it until either the obstacle gives way or they find a way to change themselves enough that the obstacle no longer applies to them. Every other species in our contact record treats difficulty as a signal to adjust direction. Humans treat difficulty as information about how hard they need to push. One of the senior council members, a Toreth named Isservok who had served on the council for longer than most species had been members, raised his speaking indicator and asked the question I had been expecting. Is this not simply persistence? We have encountered persistent species before. Persistence is not unusual. Persistence is not the issue, I said. The issue is what persistence produces in humans specifically. With other persistent species, persistence produces incremental progress. The species moves forward steadily, achieves its objectives within a reasonable time frame, and eventually reaches a stable plateau. Humans do not plateau. Look at their history. Every time they hit a ceiling, a hard limit they cannot immediately get past, the effort of hitting that ceiling changes them. They come out of the collision different, faster, smarter, more organized, more creative. The ceiling does not stop them, it upgrades them. The chamber was quiet in a way that chambers are quiet when people are listening very carefully. Show us an example, Isservok said. I had prepared for this. I put the evidence on the main display for all 47 members to see. I walked them through the human disease record, how a species with no medical technology, beyond basic herbalism had, within a few hundred years, developed tools capable of eliminating illnesses that had killed millions of their people, and had done it specifically because those illnesses kept killing millions of their people. I walked them through their energy history, how a species burning biological material for heat had, within 150 years of figuring out how to convert chemical energy to electricity, developed the capacity to split atoms and access more power than their entire civilization had used in the previous 10,000 years. I walked them through their communication history, their transportation history, their materials history. Every single time, the pattern was the same. A limitation appears. The limitation causes suffering or frustration or both. The suffering generates effort. The effort, over time, does not just solve the immediate problem. It produces capabilities that did not exist before and could not have been predicted from outside the effort. The Shriven modeling team, I noted, had attempted to run projections on human technological development using our standard models, and the projections had failed completely, not because the inputs were wrong, but because the standard models assumed a relatively stable rate of development interrupted by occasional acceleration events. Human development did not work this way. Human development accelerated in response to obstacles in a way that made linear projection essentially useless. "What you are describing," said a council member from the Mean Halath delegation, "sounds like an unstable development curve." "It is not unstable," I said. "It is not random. It is not chaotic. It is entirely consistent. It is just consistent in a direction that our models were not designed to track, because no other species has ever moved in this direction for this long without either stabilizing or collapsing." Another quiet pause. "And you believe," Isservok said carefully, "that they will not collapse." I took a breath. "I believe they have already survived everything that should have made them collapse. I believe they have survived it repeatedly and come out of each survival stronger than they were before. I believe that if we introduce them to galactic civilization and its full resources and challenges, we will not be introducing them to something that slows them down. We will be introducing them to the largest, most complex, most stimulating obstacle they have ever encountered. And I believe they will do to it exactly what they have done to every obstacle before it." "Which is?" Isservok asked, though I think he already knew the answer. "They will push against it," I said, "until it changes, or until they do, and either way, nothing in this chamber will look the same afterward." The silence that followed was the longest silence I have ever sat in. What I said next was the part that I think made the difference, because up to that point I had been presenting data, evidence, reasonable argument, and reasonable argument in the council chamber was something every member was trained to evaluate and respond to with measured consideration. They could have debated it. They could have asked for more time to study it. They could have concluded that my concerns were overstated and voted to move forward with full integration of humanity into galactic civilization. But I did not leave it as reasonable argument. I told them the truth underneath the argument. "I have spent my career meeting other civilizations," I said, "and every civilization I have ever met reached a point where they decided that what they had was enough. Maybe not consciously, maybe not in a single decision, but at some point every stable civilization in this chamber settled. They found a level of capability, a level of complexity, a level of ambition that felt sufficient. And they stopped pushing against the edges of what was possible, because pushing against edges is expensive and uncomfortable, and the edges usually push back." I looked around the chamber, 47 faces, 47 species, all looking back at me. "Humans have not done this," I said. "Not once. Not in 10,000 years of recorded history. They have never looked at what they have and decided it was enough. Not because they are greedy, not because they are reckless, because they have a relationship with the future that I have not seen in any other species. They genuinely believe that the version of themselves that has not yet existed is worth working toward. They invest in it. They sacrifice for it. They build things for it that they will never see finished, and they consider this normal, and they consider this good." I let that sit for a moment. "A civilization that has never decided it is enough," I said, "and that gets stronger every time it hits a wall, is not a civilization we can share a galaxy with on current terms. not because they will harm us, but because contact with them, full contact, genuine integration, will force every civilization in this chamber to ask a question we have not asked ourselves in a very long time. "What question?" someone asked from the back of the chamber. I said, "What are we still capable of if we decided to try?" The vote was held 3 days later. The ban passed by a margin of 39-8. I voted yes. I voted yes because I meant every word I said in that chamber, not because humanity was a threat in any conventional sense, not because I feared what they would do, but because I had looked at 47 civilizations that had all, in their own way and in their own time, decided to be comfortable. And then I had looked at one civilization that had never once made that choice. And I understood that putting those two things in the same room, without preparation, without time, without the slower civilizations having a chance to remember what they were capable of, would be a collision that no one was ready for. Banning Earth was not an act of fear. It was an act of, I believed, compassion. I believed we were giving ourselves time. I did not know then how little of it we actually had. I am recording this from a small station in the outer edges of Shriven territory, and I want to be clear that I am doing so without authorization. The collective has, as of 6 months ago, formally classified everything I have told you in the previous sections of this account. The official position is that the ban is an ongoing security measure, that the situation remains under active management, and that there is no cause for public concern. These statements are all technically accurate and also deeply incomplete, and I have decided that incomplete truth is not something I am willing to leave on the record as my only contribution to this moment in history. So here is what they are not telling you. The ban did not stop humanity. This should not surprise anyone who listened carefully to what I said in the council chamber, but I want to acknowledge that it surprised me, and I am someone who should have known better. My own argument, that humans use obstacles as fuel, apparently had not fully penetrated to the part of my reasoning that was also quietly hoping the ban would buy us a century or two of calm. We got 80 years. In those 80 years, cut off from galactic trade, from galactic resources, from the vast accumulated knowledge of 12 civilizations that had been developing technology for thousands of years longer than they had. In those 80 years, humanity developed their own faster-than-light drive. Independently. From scratch. While quarantined. When our monitoring systems detected the first human FTL transit, a small experimental vessel crossing from the Sol system to a point approximately 2 light-years away and back, the analyst who filed the report initially classified it as instrument error. It was reviewed by a senior team, confirmed, reviewed again by a different senior team, confirmed again, and then escalated to the council with a note that read in its entirety, "They have done it. We are attaching the technical data. We do not currently have a recommendation." I read that report from my research post on the outer station, and I sat with it for a long time, not because I was surprised, because I had expected it to take longer, and the fact that it had taken this little time told me something that the report itself had not said directly. The ban had not been an obstacle to humanity in the sense I had intended. I had hoped that isolation would slow them down by cutting them off from outside stimulus and outside resources. What it had actually done was give them 80 years of uninterrupted, highly motivated focus on a single problem: how to leave their solar system without anyone's help. The quarantine had not removed their fuel source. It had narrowed it to a single point and made it burn hotter. I filed an urgent communication to the council the day I read the monitoring report. I said, "They are at the border, not with weapons, with ships. The first contact will happen again, and this time we will not control the conditions. Recommend immediate reassessment of all ban-era policies." The council called an emergency session. I was not invited. The session produced a formal document that extended the ban, added additional monitoring, and requested that I submit my full personal observation records for review. I submitted most of them. The ones I did not submit are the basis of what I am about to tell you. Approximately 4 months after the first confirmed human FTL transit, a human ship crossed into Shriven monitoring space without triggering our boundary alerts. This was not a failure of our monitoring systems. They had studied our monitoring protocols, identified the gaps, and navigated through them with a precision that suggested they had been planning the route for some time. The ship was small, a 2-person vessel, by our later assessment. It came to rest within communication range of our outer station and broadcast a standard greeting on all major council frequencies, using correct protocol formats that they had apparently reconstructed from our own earlier transmissions. The message said, "This is Ambassador Clara Hinton representing the people of Earth. We are aware that a conversation is required. We would like to have it now, at your convenience." Ambassador Hinton, the same woman who had spoken to us during the original contact event. She was older now, 82 years old by human calculation, which is old for a human but not yet at the end of their natural lifespan. She had clearly spent the intervening decades doing exactly what she had been doing during that first conversation, thinking about what came next and working toward it. I was on the outer station that day. I heard the message come through the speakers. I stood in the corridor outside the communications room for a moment, and then I went in and asked the duty officer to patch me through. "Ambassador Hinton," I said, "this is Observer Veth Kalu. You may not remember me." "I remember you," she said immediately. "You were on the observation vessel during first contact. You asked me a question about our governing structure that I thought was unusually perceptive." I had not expected her to remember that. I had been one of dozens of voices in that initial exchange. "I have been wanting to speak with you for some time," she said, before I could respond to her remembering me. "There are things I think you and I understand about this situation that the official channels are not quite capturing." I looked around the communications room. The duty officer was pretending to study a display panel. "I think you may be right," I said. She asked if we could meet in person. She noted, pleasantly, that she had brought a gift, a plant from Earth, something that she said held sentimental significance for her people, and that she thought might be a reasonable opening gesture. She asked if it would be acceptable to bring it aboard. I said yes. She came aboard alone. The plant was a small tree, not yet a meter tall, in a sealed container with its own growth medium. She held it carefully with both hands and presented it to me in the corridor outside the docking bay with the expression of someone offering something genuinely valuable. "It is called an oak," she said. "It will grow very large if you give it time and space. The people who planted the parent tree of this one did not live to see it reach full height. Neither will I at this point, but someone will." I looked at the small tree in its container. I thought about everything I had written about humans and their relationship to futures they would not personally inhabit. I thought about 10,000 years of buildings and plans and investments in people not yet born. Then I looked at Clara Hinton, who was 82 years old and had just crossed quarantine space in a small ship, to have a conversation that the government she represented had probably not fully authorized, and who was standing in a corridor on a Shriven station, holding a tree that someone else would see grow tall. "You know," I said, "when I argued for the ban, I said some things about your species that I stand by completely." "I know," she said. "I read the leaked summary." "There were some things I did not say," I said. "Things I understood but could not quite put into the official language." She waited. "When I voted to ban Earth," I said, "I told the council that your civilization was unlike anything we had encountered, that you use difficulty as fuel, that you build toward futures you will not see, that you have never once looked at what you have and decided it was sufficient." I paused. I framed all of that as something we needed to be cautious about. And now, she asked. I thought about the child and the tree. I thought about the weapons standoff that almost ended everything and did not. I thought about Owen Bray and the spicy noodle dish, and the Toreth diplomat asking for a recipe, and the 17 species who had discovered that something which caused a little pain could be the best thing they had ever tasted. I thought about 47 civilizations in a chamber, all of them settled and stable and thoroughly comfortable, not one of them having pushed against the edges of what they were capable of in longer than I could accurately remember. And I thought about what I had said to them that day, the question I told them humanity would force them to ask. What are we still capable of if we decided to try? I had framed that as a warning. I had meant it to sound like something that needed to be managed and controlled and kept at a careful distance. But standing in that corridor, holding a small oak tree that Clara Hinton would not live to see reach its full height, I understood, not for the first time, but for the first time with full clarity, that I had been afraid of the wrong thing. We had not needed protection from humanity. We had needed something far rarer and far more valuable, and we had had it within reach and turned it away. We had needed to be reminded. Reminded that discomfort is not a reason to stop, that a future you will never see is still worth building, that the ceiling is not where you live, it is where the next floor begins, that the edges of what is possible are not walls. They are the part of the map that says there is still something beyond this point, and that somewhere, someone is deciding whether to go there. We had banned Earth because we were afraid of what humanity would become inside galactic civilization. The truth, which I understand now with perfect clarity, is that we were afraid of what humanity would make us remember about ourselves. We had settled, all of us, every civilization in that chamber, every species in the council. We had found our level of capability and decided it was enough and quietly, gradually, over the span of centuries, stopped pushing. And then we had found a species that had never done this, not once, not ever, and we had called it dangerous, and we had called it a threat, and we had put a wall around it and told ourselves it was for safety. It was not for safety. It was because we did not want to feel embarrassed about what we had settled for. Clara Hinton was still watching me, patient, neither hurrying me nor filling the silence, just waiting the way someone waits when they are confident that the other person is getting somewhere important. I think, I said, that we need to have a very different kind of conversation than the official channels have been having. Yes, she said simply. And I think, I said, that we need to have it without waiting for authorization from people who have already decided what the answer is. Also yes, she said. I looked at the oak tree, small and patient and completely unaware of how tall it would eventually be, because it was a tree and trees do not think about such things. But the person who had brought it here knew and had brought it anyway, because that was the kind of person she was, and that was the kind of species she came from. Come in, I said, let us talk. What happened in that conversation is a separate account, and not one I am prepared to write in full yet, partly because it is still happening and partly because some of what was said needs more time before it can be put into words without losing something essential in the translation. But I can tell you this. After she left, I sat down at my recording terminal. I filed a brief, entirely personal note in my private log. It was not addressed to the council. It was not addressed to the collective. It was addressed to whoever finds this account, whenever that might be, in whatever world exists by then. It said, we made a mistake. We called it caution. We called it wisdom. We called it the responsible management of an unknown variable. We put it in careful language and filed it in official documents and voted on it in a chamber full of very old civilizations that had forgotten how it felt to stand at the edge of something genuinely new and decide to go forward anyway. We should have learned from them. Instead, we tried to contain them. You cannot contain something that uses containment as fuel. They are already here. They brought a tree. They want to talk. They are not angry, they are not demanding. They are doing exactly what they have always done, which is look at the situation in front of them, understand it completely, and start figuring out what comes next. I do not know what comes next. I do not think anyone does. But for the first time in 31 years as an observer, I am not afraid of not knowing. I am something else. Something I had to reach back through my memory to find a proper name for, because I have not felt it in so long that the word for it had started to feel theoretical. I am curious. The oak tree is on my desk. It is small, and it does not know yet what it will be. Neither do any of us. That is, I think, the whole point. End of account. Observer Veth Kalu Shriven Collective Intelligence Division. This record is personal, unauthorized, and encrypted under my private seal. If you are reading it, then either I chose to release it or someone found it after the fact. Either way, do not waste it. Do something with it. That is what they would do.